I never decided to be an artist. I grew up in Port Arthur, Texas, and there weren't any artists. But no one knew what an artist was.
For American artists, the 1960s was an explosive decade, and Jasper Johns and Robert Rauschenberg triggered the explosion. Their painterly style came from action painting of the 50s, but their common subjects were derived from the popular culture of the day. Bold, colorful images reflected the optimism of the Kennedy era, while mass media channeled these images back to a public program for visual sensation. John Cage's advice to artists: join the world around them.
This is 1963, in case this thing is ever found.
I think it's terrific. I think that is very...
In a so-called joyous time of the 60s, famous for happy rock, you know, the Beatles were at the height of invention, and optimism was there.
Where are we? I can't remember. Where are we? At a party.
Publicity and fashion and bright colors, entertainment.
Happenings, theater pieces, and technology broke down boundaries between the arts. New forms, new media, new techniques established the leadership of the American avant-garde, and many artists became intent on defining their art as uniquely American. Although abstract expressionism liberated American art from Europe, it was left to the artists of the 60s to consolidate their revolution. The success of the New York school now provided younger, native-born artists with local heroes. As art was integrated into American life, it became more difficult to shock the public. Serious, profound, frivolous, absurd, and ultimately tragic, the contradictions and paradoxes of the 60s were reflected in American art of that revolutionary decade.
I mean, artists aren't good people or bad people, but the ability for the work to be able to represent itself instead of something else is very critical at this time. Because the work begins from one point of view and is accepted from so many others that the work loses its meaning almost instantly.
I think the most popular misconception about pop art is that it failed to invent new forms. And not only do I think that the pop artist invented strong new forms, I think what's yet unknown is the range of the ambition of various so-called pop artists.
A fantastic variety of new images flooded galleries and museums. Artists like James Rosenquist made gigantic paintings resembling giant billboards that were based on advertisements, magazine reproductions, and other commercially generated popular images. Familiar common objects were blown up to room-sized proportions, and fluorescent colors heightened the psychedelic impact. Artists like Jim Dine combined painted backgrounds with real objects. George Siegel arranged his plaster sculptures in pictorial groups. Abstract artists evolved striking new formats. Geometric images, which gave a greater priority to brilliant optical effects. Socially oriented artists like Ed Kienholz created sharp social satire and political criticism in controversial works, while Jasper Johns and Robert Rauschenberg took a more detached attitude to the peculiarities of the American scene.
Material's material, but I was returned toward cardboard because of its yielding quality. I mean, I don't have to be strong to use it. All material has its own history built into it. There's not better material. I mean, it's just as unnatural for people to use oil paint as it is to use anything else. It's an artist manufactures his material. out of his own existence and his own either ignorance or familiarity or confidence. Yeah. The cardboard pieces are paintings. I think maybe coming out of really being, excuse me, Mother, real white trash, authentically, gave me a sense of absolutely no fear of any other category. There was an atmosphere at Black Mountain College which was, in every situation except the painting or in the arts, was about freedom. In the arts, it was about discipline and control of control. I needed discipline, and Albers was the world's greatest disciplinarian. John Cage had a fantastic influence on my thinking. He simply gave me permission to go on thinking that he was the only one who gave me permission to go on thinking the way I was thinking.
Well, what was important about it, it seems to me, were the students in it. And the only thing I warned them about was that I was interested in experimentation, and that if they weren't experimental enough, that I would tend to criticize them. And it was Bob Rauschenberg who opened my eyes really to what we then called, I don't know what you call it now, representational art. What do you call it now?
The nature of some of the materials I worked with got so impossible to physically to figure out how they could be supported on the wall. It was obvious that they had no business just hanging flatly on the wall. And that's the beginning of the combines. I guess the bed could be considered the first combine. When I did the bed, it was, I just literally ran out of things to paint on. And there was this quilt, and it was summer, and I didn't need that. So I thought it's good, because I'd been working on flat surfaces with and covering them with, because I was into color then, I was covering them with funny papers. I showed a long time without anybody liking the work. I was called the clown. I was supposed to be either against art or just funny. I don't believe in either accident or chance. I come to terms with my materials. Sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't, but I would substitute anything for preconception or deliberateness. I mean, if that moment can't be as fresh and as strange and as unpredictable as what's going on all around you, then it's false.
With respect to art, for instance, that long ago we thought of it as self-expression. Then, yeah, I think that would be very... Then, more and more, it came to mean to me not self-expression, but self-alteration. I frequently stayed at Jap's house here on Houston Street. It was such a pleasure to wake up in the morning and converse with him and look out those large windows. And I remember when Jasper Johns saw the last work of Duchamp, I asked him what he thought of it, and he said it'll certainly be the strangest thing in any museum.
There wasn't any resistance to the abstract expressionists by like the painters that I knew at that time. I think only Jasper Johns and myself gave them enough respect not to copy them.
In March '57, that was really the turning point in my career, because I went there and there were all the familiar people, and walking through this very familiar thing, I suddenly stumbled upon a green painting. That was in '57, March '57. And I said, Jasper Johns, that's just an assumed name, something like that. Who did it? The day after that, I was going down to Rauschenberg's studio to see the paintings, to think about a show. And at that very moment, Jasper came, and I found out that he had the studio just below Bob's. And so he took me down, and I had this tremendous impression of flags, white flags, red, white, and blue flags, targets, numbers, what have you. And it was one of the great impressions of my life, and I immediately asked Jasper, would he want to come to the gallery? And so he said, in his spare way, yes, he would consider it.
The two stones have been done.
Two stones.
And have we got the proofs with all the other stuff on it?
Yeah.
Because I'm wondering what wasn't right.
Okay.
Whether it was this ink
Do you want
or...
to see the separation proof for the next run, or would you like to see the final proof that we made for the day with all
I
five?
think everything together would be helpful. So here it looks a little softer than here, and I think that's better.
But the impact was immediate because although pop art came, say, 2 years, about 2.5 years after the show occurred, it took 2 years to mature. There was a gestation of about 2 years until Lichtenstein, Oldenburg. Oldenburg was actually much more expressionist than, say, Lichtenstein at that time, or for that matter, Warhol or Rosenquist.
In his encaustic flag, Jasper Johns raised the question of whether the flag was an object or a painting. Later, Johns continued his baffling juxtapositions of three-dimensional objects and their painted equivalents. His pictures were full of tension, especially the tension between recognizable images and abstract sensuous brushwork. Obsessed with verbal visual puns, Johns labeled objects as Larry Rivers, another pop pioneer, had done earlier.
I get left-handed compliments from other painters who, they may not like my work, but they tell me that they found in the choices that I made for certain kinds of subject matter, things like that, a certain relaxed attitude that enabled them to choose things that they might not have thought of before. Why do I think that the paintings of the 50s, most of the abstract painting, ran its course? I think because it had built into it certain possibilities which individuals got tired of mining. It became, I think it became business. The general consensus is that it ran out of steam. But as a matter of fact, what it did was open up so many possibilities for other things that people just got interested in the other things. For instance, Roy Lichtenstein told me that after he saw Washington Cross in Delaware, it was years later because he hadn't seen the painting, but he heard about it after it was shown. I did it in 53, but it wasn't shown until about 55, let's say, in the museum. And he told me he did a painting on Custer's Last Stand.
I don't think that pop art is an art style. I think there are some individual artists which will be termed pop, and they're all so different from one another. I think there's some common ground in the emphasis on a commercial subject or pseudo-commercial ways of working, but I think the images are so different that I don't see much similarity between the artists. I think a lot of painters are interested in doing works based on other works. It's not supposed to be a put-down of the earlier work. It's just to re-see, to do in your own terms now, some theme that interested lots of people. I didn't paint only comic strips. I think it was just inexpensively reproduced graphic work. It was the quality of printing and the quality of communication, an inexpensive level. The form change that went on in order to reproduce images inexpensively, the combination of reshaping the image into some sort of idealized product or person, plus reproducing him in an inexpensive way, made certain images that I thought were useful and which characterized our world. I choose representation to give me a variety of forms. It's an excuse to change the way you work, or it's just some reason to put a particular shape down, rather than to invent a pattern. I'm just masking off the part that I'm going to repaint, because I'm going to take this yellow off completely
And I don't want to mess up the rest of the canvas, so I'm just masking off that area. And I'll scrub that paint off and start from the beginning.
On a farm in New Jersey, George Siegel uses an abandoned chicken coop as his studio.
I asked many questions. The Cage Cunningham Duchamp tradition was a thrust for cerebral quality and coolness, distance removal. I came from abstract expressionism's earthiness, guttiness, expressionism. You know, my belly sticks out too much, and I love to eat. You know, I'm sloppy, and I painted, you know, a lot of drips on my canvases. So did Dine, so did Oldenburg. You know, like we share some kind of common expressionist background. But none of us could recapitulate abstract expressionism quite. This concern with going back to yourself with autobiography, I think is true in pop art, is one of those common denominators. Dealing with the things around you that are yours, you know, out of your experience. I started working in plaster mostly because I was disgusted with my own painting. You know, I wanted to move into 3 dimensions, real space. I'd been painting figuratively, you know, life-size figures on canvases. I was angry, impatient, and looking for fast material. I had no money. Couldn't afford bronze, and I didn't like all the intermediate steps. I wanted to be working directly. So you go to a lumber yard and you buy 100 pounds of plaster for 8 or 9 cents a pound. It's chalky white. It takes the impression of any texture. It flows like water. I can handle it like watercolor. It dries like rock. I can chip it. I can model it. I can be smooth. I can be rough. You know, like all these qualities are there, and they're useful, and I like them. Because of Duchamp, there's no hesitation about using mechanical means, using machinery, using objects, using helps in aids in representation, you know, using reproduction process. Because of a whole list of ideas in modern art that have to do with conception, an artist doesn't have to display his virtuoso drawing ability, you know, his ability to reproduce nature before he's allowed to make any statement. That terrible dilemma of personal pouring forth, you know, the stroke, the touch, the meaning of the mark, in collision with the outside world. And what happens in that collision could be the mark of our generation. This piece is the costume party. I did it about 1965. This piece has been haunting me for years. Ever since I've done it, I've been continually changing it. This piece doesn't have any setting, I think because it doesn't need it. It's really about internal state of mind. Dark, satanic things have to do with accepting the presence of the devil, which means having a moral standard, which means believing in right and wrong. And all that seemed totally suspended in the 60s. And yet I was dogged by the sense of the devil.
In Happenings, John Cage's advice to mix art and life found fruition. This artist's theater was an outgrowth of painting in which real action and real forms spilled out into real space. Recalling the absurdist antics of Dada, Futurist, and Bauhaus performances, Happenings were part of the 60s drive toward liberation of primitive instincts and a call for spontaneous behavior.
Most of my friends were entranced with Cage's attitudes, which had to do with heightening everybody's awareness toward everything in the world around them. And in its most vulgar, simplified form, you know, like everybody could be an artist, which was responsible for a lot of the participation ideas in the Happenings.
There was never any plot in the things that were called happenings, and it was just a series of repeating actions over and over related to the construction. I mean, my work has always been very closely related to theater, and a lot of the inspiration, especially in New York, is directed towards theater, because New York is a place where people are always acting out their emotions.
In the late 60s, the center of the art scene shifted downtown to the low-rent lofts and warehouses of Soho. A Saturday opening and concert of new music draws crowds to the lively scene. Although pop art became celebrated first, other directions were also being explored. The most important of these were minimal art and hard edge and color-field abstraction. The last, championed as post-painterly abstraction by critic Clement Greenberg, emphasized pure color relationships, extending the ideas of Impressionism and Fauvism. But minimal art was a purely American phenomenon. It stressed the specific quality of unaltered materials and the concreteness of the work of art, which often resembled a common object. Minimal art's most important spokesman became Donald Judd. His studio is a classic cast iron building in Soho, where he lives and works.
I was, on the whole, not influenced by any sculpture because I didn't think I was doing sculpture, and still don't. The real influence, or something that is in the work, is the 3 or 4 general assumptions that come from Pollock, Newman, Rothko, and so forth. First place I painted for a long time, about 10 years. I couldn't get what I wanted. I didn't like the flatness. I didn't like them being against the wall. And I couldn't get around the problem of there always being something within the rectangle. I got a painting down to where it was nothing but a surface. I kept painting it and applying paint, fooling around with it, and still didn't like it. And then finally I bent up the ends. The thing that really interests me most is sitting around thinking about the pieces and figuring out what I want to do. The general point is that you deal with what you know and with what you can do and a particular situation. Like the people who would be called minimal artists weren't all doing work at the same time. I think Carl's work was a little later in development than mine and Morris's, and in the beginning I didn't know Morris's and Morrison. I didn't know each other's work. And also I don't think there's much connection between me and Morris. And you know, I think in 20 years it all look a little more similar than it might have looked at the moment.
You can tell people in Europe, one of these kids is not ours.
Well, it's
Judd's sculptures, like those of other minimal artists, are explicitly machine-made. But Dan Flavin's use of standard fluorescent lights eventually led him from specific objects to a more elaborate system of designing entire environments.
Though the installation must look very stable to a certain extent, I think it's easily understood with a slight confounding paradox as far as the lamps operate out of the corners and with the corners.
Flavin uses real light rather than the painted illusion of light. Patterns created from the repetition of standard industrial units are arranged so that the total environment is perceived as a whole. Light divides and illuminates three-dimensional space, as Barnett Newman divided his canvas fields into zones of color light earlier. Minimal art's focus on the literal may be traced to Frank Stella's early works, in which Stella first cut literal shapes out of canvas.
I knew Mondrian and I knew Albers, that is, I knew their work. And the distinction between what they did and what, say, real action painters like de Kooning and Pollock did didn't seem to bother me or be even especially significant. I never liked the Europeans. It seemed to me they simply didn't do it as well as the Americans, or they did it in a more reserved or in a more not so much cagey as just a slightly more pampered way of handling the whole thing. Color and surface and shape get tied together and become very interdependent, that's all. Some pictures that I did in the early 60s and, you know, so the very late 50s, like the black paintings, were at the time considered very, very big, particularly by the dealers who had to try to sell them. I liked the quality of the black paintings, and I particularly liked the quality of their flatness, or the quality that they had that seemed to go out more than recede. In other words, when you looked at them, you tended to see them there on the wall, or they had a slight tendency to come towards you rather than fall away from you or let you get into them. Since I have an idea of myself as being fairly small, maybe, or something like that, a little bigger than myself, a little bigger than life size, I guess, but largely because it gives you room or an area or just a feeling of having enough space to work on. I had been working on the drawings for what were to be the aluminum paintings, and I had pretty much decided on the aluminum paint because I had seen some paint samples that I liked. So then I simply took the drawing and I erased out the corners, and that eliminated the rectangular shape of the drawings and made them into shaped drawings. Metallic paint seemed to offer possibilities for even more flatness or more resistance to the viewer. I used fluorescent color for quite a while. It's not so much that it literally jumps a little bit more than the other colors, but it affects the other colors because of its intensity around it in different kinds of ways. I like the color in the stripe paintings, and I like the color in the eccentric polygons. I mean, I don't know exactly what a fine artist technique would be, but as far as technique used for making abstract paintings, it seems to me that just about any technique will do. What I find that I'm almost always involved in is organizing whatever surface I'm going to work on. I tend to organize it in fairly regular or coherent and, or at least consistent ways, which tend to look like some kind of ordinary geometry. I knew that hard edge painting existed, and I could see the difference between, say, hard edge painting, like Ellsworth Kelly, and and the rest of abstract expressionist painting. I mean, loose brushwork and hard or geometric abstraction, they seem to be different.
Yeah, I did a lot of panel pictures like this, say, in the middle 50s, and then a lot of the curved shapes appeared in 54, 55, 56. And then I started doing the panel pictures again. I was doing the pictures, with the two different panels like that, and then I did some drawings and collages of this, and I just liked it and kept on going with it. Each of the reds is a little different, and it's a question of the two colors together. It's like seeing, like the shape of your pants, say, like that, a Y, thick blue Y, against the background. It's just a shape, a color. It has more to do with that than, I guess, with, geometric painting.
I went to Paris in 1947. So that's where art was then, and that's where I went.
I liked, I liked French architecture. I mean, Romanesque things, the way Paris is built, and I liked living there.
The first thing in my piece really to get to me were the ink drawings. The cut paper works, I saw those only later, only after I'd returned to New York and had been living in New York for several years. I think that getting away from nature is almost an impossible thing to do. And I liked in general the use of mass in American art. The big surfaces and the massive forms like in Rothko. And also the work of my friend Kelly. I like very much the things he was doing then, which were simple, delineated, massive, monumental shapes. And I think that the bigness and expansion of American paintings relates in a very direct way to the expansionism of foreign policy. And it's very much like in the time of the Caesars when everybody was trying to make bigger and bigger sculptures.
You can say that modernist art makes explicit everything that the old masters took implicitly. And in making everything explicit, every aspect of the art of painting begins to count. The surface begins to count much more than it ever did before in an explicit way. And that's why these technical moves began to bulk so large. I met Nolan at Black Mountain. I taught there one summer, Black Mountain College, and he was one of the students there. And then we stayed in touch. And Nolan brought Lewis to see me here in New York in 1953.
Morris Louis died in 1962 of lung cancer, but before his death, he created 3 major series of paintings: the Smoky Veils, Luminous Unfurls, and the late Optically Brilliant Stripes. His technique remains a mystery because he refused to be observed painting. Pouring, spilling, and soaking acrylic paints into raw canvas, Louis eliminated brushstrokes in favor of a unified color field. Lewis's seriousness and dedication especially impressed fellow Washingtonian Kenneth Noland.
I suppose that the turning point for me as an artist was around 1957, 58, and 59. The tendency to center had been latent in painting ever since Cézanne's time, actually. Of course, Pollock tended to center too. It began to appear in quite a few different artists' work. I mean, for instance, Albers went to homage to the square pictures. Johns made targets. Rothko more or less centered everything in a kind of a frontal way. So, well, it didn't really come out emphatically in my work until I began to paint my circle pictures. My pictures have to be able to move through multiple scales of focus and then reaffirm the shape and size of the picture.
I first saw Jackson Pollock's paintings at a show he had at Betty Parsons in the fall of '50. And I think what I particularly responded to was that there was an all-at-once, overall, this happened quality to it. The picture called Mountains and Sea I painted in October 1952. I'd done a lot of landscapes on folding easels that summer, and had already been very aware of Pollock, Gorky, Hoffman, de Kooning, and had already started to really break out of collegiate cubism. I think what I wanted was exposure to Hans Hofmann's spirit. I didn't need the push-pull vocabulary because I'd already gotten that through cubism, and actually it was about the same thing, which had to do with how linear planes move in perspective on what is, in fact, a flat surface with 4 corners.
Well, actually, the staining technique, of course, comes from Pollock, like originally. And Helen Frankenthaler was staining, and then Morris Louis found a way of using it for himself, and then a little later I found a way of using it for myself. And Cubism went to contours, went to edges, overlapping planes. When you stain, you get whatever area of color that you're using to become kind of common with the ground. But if you've got an extent of blue, say an area of blue or a field of blue, then you would probably say that's a beautiful blue. You would identify it as color rather than as something that is colored.
I had to develop my own technique, but I think technique determines aesthetic as much as one's aesthetic determines a new medium. The making of them, controlling them, and the surprise from them is a gesture that I do best, feeling that the edges can spread and that I can manipulate the paint and the sides in relation to top, bottom, drawing, spilling, staining, tinting, with much more reach and fewer limits. My best pictures are generally my large pictures, which I think is true of most abstract painters. And I think that's because of edges and surface and another kind of perspective and limitlessness. Cropping is, well, I haven't cut this yet, but clearly it will be cut so that you don't see that, and then I don't want a border or line or strip all the way on one side of this picture. So that the structure, if you can imagine, as I said, that line, straight up and down. In other words, the yellow will show here. It won't show here. That'll be cut off. It will show from here to the edge. And I like this sort of brushy, unfinished looking part.
It's too thick. Add some water.
A what?
I'll start here and see what happens. And just keep going. And then suddenly you stop. And I use a rather primitive mixing gadget. And begin by just pouring it on the canvas. If I've begun with an ocean, I want to use a roller and see what will happen with thick paint and a roller so that a certain kind of surface may develop. If I go slowly, it's making for a surface of a kind that I may not have used before. And think what will happen in the process of doing that. I may find I don't like it. And try it out. Here I am in this position, and this has happened as I push the squeegee across. I would find it probably irresistible to wonder, well, what will happen if I pull it back this way? You know, will anything happen? Well, that's happened. And so I have to decide, do I want that or not? Now, a lot of times you put something on, you anticipate what may happen, but I don't really know for certain, because it depends a lot on what something will dry looking like.
You ask if California breeds eccentricity. Sure, I think in a way it does. Not that it breeds it, but it welcomes it. California is the great dream, and people who can't stand the grind in Pendar, Nebraska, or Oshkosh, or Tampa, they pick a spot. It's either New York or it's California. The ones that come to California make a bigger pilgrimage. They are more in tune with the people who originally came with wagon across the Mojave Desert to find the West Coast.
During the 60s, an important art center developed outside New York in Los Angeles. The influence of European art was virtually non-existent, so California artists felt free to pursue highly individual and sometimes bizarre personal styles. With its balmy climate and folksy informality, Los Angeles fostered a vigorous independence.
I grew up on a farm and I drove tractors, And I worked in mental hospitals. I sold cars in car lots. A two-dimensional surface is really a stupid illusion. I can't abide it. I just get really bored with it all. But you take the same surface and build it out or make an armature or affix an object to it, and it suddenly has a whole other quality. It has another dimension. It's like running, to me, to work in two-dimension would be like running a foot race with one leg and a crutch. Five-car stud. It's a tableau concerned with a black man and a white woman in a pickup truck, and they are sitting drinking. All the evidence within the truck indicates that they're just sitting there talking or drinking. And there's four of the cars pull up around him. The guys get out and they drag the black man out of the truck, and they're in the process of castrating him. What it has to do is, to me, is the psychological castration that this country imposes upon anyone that is different. And there's a great connection between the myth of the blacks' sexuality. Yeah, I've been censored quite a bit in my work. Censored in the sense that people won't show them. I make what I want to make. America's got a lot of faults, but at least the problems and the questions are out on the surface. Most often what happens to me is that I'll wake up early in the morning, like 5 o'clock or so, and I think about things, and then I go to sleep for a couple hours. And I just woke up one morning and I knew that I wanted to see a woman in place of a keyboard on a piano. I just wanted to see how that would look. And since it's doing it.
When I left Oklahoma, I had a choice of two places, really. I could go to New York and I could go to California, and I liked hot rods and palm trees, and there was an extension. It was an extension of Oklahoma. I've always wanted to paint images, and I usually paint images that are same size. When I paint an object, I'll paint an object that is the same size as it is. And there's only a few examples of times when I've painted pictures that they haven't been the same size as they are. The reason I like to paint letters is because there's a world of no size in this. Billboards have affected me just by their pure size, not because of their giant abstraction or anything like that. Well, I started this about 3 or 4 months ago, and I've worked on it right here on the floor all the time. And I'm building a big easel now to put this on so I don't have to lean over and break my back. But it's just a sheet of paper. I just picked tobacco just because of the marks it makes. I suppose I have learned from surrealism. I mean, it's just as surreal in Oklahoma as it is, in Texas, as it is in Montana, as it is in everywhere else.
Well, I think all paintings are illusions. And I think all paintings are flat. And so that's how I defined it, at least for myself. I first started working with isometric shapes, and then 1-point, 2-point, and 3-point perspective. See, I stopped painting on canvas in 1965, 66, I guess. Up to that time, I had rolled acrylic on canvas with paint rollers. But then I've got a spray gun, and was spraying on canvas. But when you spray canvas, you get a fur. So I got a piece of glass, which was my first mold, and just made a sheet of plastic, and then adhered a wooden stretcher bar to that sheet of plastic. So I had a hard, smooth surface, which didn't take a lot of sanding. Ready to paint on, but it seemed very easy at that point, because why not just put the color right in the plastic? The technology is available here in California. They make a lot of surfboards and a lot of plastic cars and boats and things. It's been going on here for 25 years, at least. What I consider to be my most major series would be the dodecagons, which are a 12-sided shape. And it derives from a section of a Uccello painting. I started working with illusions in 1963. I don't like to give anything up, and so I've added on the soft edges. I hope I feel free to use transparent colors or opaque colors or hard edge or soft edge or painterly edge or the drips and the splatters and the marbleizing are part of my vocabulary. And the only difference is just whether the brush is touching the surface or it is lifted off the surface. The arm movements, as it were, are the same. I think Pollock led the way in terms of introducing what I like to call galactic space. I like to introduce so-called galactic space into my perspective interiors. So even though there's an illusion of an interior there, the painting itself will be perhaps galactic.
In the beginning, the New York School was very impressive to me. When it came west, my early painting was a very personal expression, and for me, not a question of all over or not all over. You know, it was, I think, in terms of Pollock, it was, I mean, if he was an influence when I was young, you know, and that whole New York scene, it unlocked in me a certain particular kind of energy that I could get a hold of. And very important to me in that way personally. But I couldn't tell you what the meaning of it was, you know, the all over, or I couldn't describe it to you.
Were you always an abstract painter?
Yeah. I was always an abstract painter. No, I don't think my paintings belong to the New York School. I'm interested in internal oppositions, yeah, right. Well, I'm interested in, let's say, all opposites. I don't get light in my paintings. There's a maximum of light there, and I take away until to the point where if I took more away, it would be too bad. Then I stop. My attitude towards color is that it's another form of energy that radiates, definitely. All art is a religious and mystical experience to me.
I don't really think that revolutions cause change. Change causes revolutions. What happens is that at a certain point, when the shape of our heads has changed to a great enough degree that the world around us, the physical world around us, becomes restrictive in a way, we're forced to, in a sense, carry out a kind of revolutionary activity. In other words, we have to act it out socially. Real change comes over a long span of time and is probably not recognizable and can't be assigned to an individual.
I think in America you are driving large Cadillacs and you live in large houses and everything is large anyway. So it wasn't really very surprising to come out with a 6-foot print. We believed in the magic of California. That the sun shining makes you very happy, that you don't have to fight the taxi cabs or the rain or the elements of winter, and etc., that it would affect the artists, that they would come here and leaving the cold winter of the East Coast, come to the warm sunshine, swim in the California pools, they would certainly be more relaxed. And I think the concentration perhaps was greater in the medium than if it was transposed into New York City. In the Sam Francis prints, you have a situation where Sam has worked directly onto the silk. He's painted on the silk with tush, with paintbrush, and he puts all the screens together with a light underneath so that he can see all the superimposition of each color. Then they go through a series of color proofing with the printer. Sam selects the color, and each one is scrambled so that he can get a chance to see the screen images in various positions on the sheet of paper. I think the reason why Jem and I wanted to make the large print was in the beginning we were involved in increasing the dimension of lithography, and we considered increasing size one of the important things to do in this area. As we announced this to each artist that we worked with, the artist would be very excited normally about the size, the scale. You have to see something. So we produced stones, laminated stones together, got large plates, and by constantly showing them the equipment, the facility, they were impressed and they got stimulated, and then they started to make designs and ideas for larger prints.
The soft sculpture, I think, very definitely came out of performances. And sewing is very much a part of theater, in that you're making costumes and props. And the quickest way to make anything in theater is to sew it. I found that that's a great way to fill space. I really got to like soft things. I got to like the way they fall, the way they look, and they change all the time. And again, subject to condition. They really express whatever situation they're in very well. They take the stamp of where they are. And the end of '61, the store was opened as a sort of gallery, but in the form of a store. And people walked into the store and they could enjoy the structure of the store as well as, and the pieces in it individually and totally, and as well as purchase the items which were in the store. The whole point of it was really, to me, to get into color, which is always my struggle, is to get into some kind of a color mass sensation. You know, something between painting and sculpture, and seeing things in the stores like toys, especially toys, that suggested a way of doing that. And so I began to imitate toys and clothing and all the things in the stores. So it's really, my work is about, it takes place in an urban atmosphere, but it's about nature. It's about natural things happening. The plug is related to the forces of nature by softening it, by making a substitution of material, let's say, by substituting a yielding material like canvas, this happens to be denim, for the hard material which one would associate with a mechanical or urban landscape. It's really not urban, is not the point. It's mechanical. Well, I think that all mechanical objects have a tendency to relate to the human body because people make them in their own image. Some artists do make things when they imitate existing things or reproduce them, such as Jasper Johns and George Siegel. They make them the same size as the original. But of course, if I made an electric plug the same size as the original, it would be very small, and I couldn't do any monumental projects with it. Just as softening, substituting material creates a metamorphic effect, so scale has also the capacity to change the effect of an object. So if I make a very small drawing of a large object, that's a kind of magic, you know, in itself. And then the problem of detail comes in much more. There's a lot of detail created in the soft sculpture simply by the way that the fabric moves and falls. Because I did it with public property, using, say, the island of Manhattan for my technique, I intruded into other people's lives. And when they saw it, they didn't see it as an artist's technique for establishing scale. They saw it as a bona fide proposal, and therefore they had to come to certain conclusions about what this proposal might mean. See, what I developed was a whole set of symbols that I took from my surroundings, and I keep using these symbols over and over again in different contexts. Originally, this particular piece, I acquired it because I wanted to make a soft version of the Winged Victory. Anything we want out of Western civilization, I guess, that survives, we can have in some form or another, in a photograph or a reproduction.
Western civilization is it's the other side of the Eastern civilization. So there isn't, I don't think there's really any big change. Well, I don't think people really like art. They just, it's just displayed nicely in museums. Culture is slowly disappearing. I guess actually it goes in two directions. It goes up and down, and hard and soft. And I guess anything that is the easiest is really culture. I like painting because it just, I liked mechanical painting better before, but now I like abstract pseudo painting because you can do it without even thinking more so easier. It can be messy and just drip all over the place. It's so easy. Mostly everything is easy if you do it without thinking about it. Nowadays, you don't have to be talented to be an artist. My paintings are more like magazine pictures because they're actually from pictures from magazines. Yeah, I guess to be an artist now, it's, well, there's more of them because there are more people. And but just going to Europe and seeing artists that have done a lot of, done artwork that they were artists then too.
My feeling about Andy Warhol is that most people don't yet understand that he lives a lifestyle of imitation of Christ. That his most effective images are icons, almost religious icons, that you can only compare his lifestyle to that of Genet or Gorky in the lower depths, or finding incredible value in discarded human beings.
No, I don't think I'm a revolutionary artist. What I learned from old art was to do old art. Old art is painting on canvas, and I paint on canvas. The art of the future, it's not movies. It's, I think it's political art.
There's a certain dilution, maybe thanks to mass culture. Mass culture invades. Everybody wants to be avant-garde now.
And Satie made the most lovely remark about criticism. He said, in an article concerned with the music among animals, he said they don't have any critics. He said the wolf doesn't criticize the sheep, he eats him.